Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel, TCNT, which True Crime and Trials. So, Mark Sievers trial day 7. First witness up was Linda Otterstotter. She's the trace evidence specialist, and she's a witness from the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial, and they went through questions that have been asked before. Also, she put together a PowerPoint presentation about fibres and fibre analysis. So they played that whole thing again and went through what it all meant. She said that she got around 40 items of evidence to examine, including the blue jumpsuit that was found at the side of the road. And in her analysis, she found that the fibres from that blue jumpsuit were cotton and nylon, and the colours of the fibres was purple and purple, blue, white. These fibres matched fibres that were found on Dr. Teresa's dress and her leg, also in the rental car and on the kitchen floor where Teresa was found. Then it was the defence's turn, and Linda can't say that the blue fibres that were found matched specifically to that jumpsuit that they had found that was in evidence. She only had that specific jumpsuit, so she only tested that jumpsuit against the fibres that were found. Also, there was no pet hairs found either in the car or on the jumpsuit, and the Sievers had 2 dogs. So then next we were on to Cherie Ventris. She works at the FBI lab, and she's the DNA caseworker. Again, she was in the Jimmy Ray Rogers trial, and she'd put together a PowerPoint presentation, so they played that again and went through all that. She reviews the cases, and she decides what evidence should be sent for testing, and then she will collate a report with all the evidence and the test results and testify in court if she needs to. She specialises in testing mitochondrial DNA, which is DNA that's specifically from the mother's side. And then the evidence that she tested was buccal swabs from Rogers and a collection of hairs, and one of those hairs came from the jumpsuit. So she tested the hair against the buccal swab from Rogers, and she could not exclude that hair coming from Rogers, which I mean, they've got to say it in a certain way. They can't say, yeah, it's definitely Rogers, but it's basically saying his hair was found on the jumpsuit that was recovered from the side of the road. That hair sample was too small to be able to do any more tests on. Once they'd done that DNA test, they couldn't. Basically the hair was destroyed, so there wasn't enough to do any further DNA testing. Then it was the cross-examination. She can't say how long hairs and things have been on a piece of evidence like the jumpsuit, and she said that no hammers that she knew of were submitted for testing either. The backpack was sent for testing, but she doesn't have the results for that because she didn't perform the test on it, and she didn't find any of Teresa's hair on the jumpsuit either, nor in the rental car. And this witness liked to go into a lot of detail, which was frustrating the defence attorney. I kept looking at him and he kept rolling his eyes at her, but she were given as much information as she could. I mean, he might have been getting frustrated with it, but I'm sure the jury was interested to know about DNA testing and what she had to do the tests and things. Then the wonderful Taylor Showmaker again, and she definitely looked a lot different to what she did in the Rogers trial. In the Rogers trial, she was very scared, she was very quiet, and she kept her head turned and down. But today, as you can see from the picture, she looked very smart, her hair was done, she was very confident. Anyway, to me, she was giving the impression that she doesn't want to be there and she couldn't be bothered because she was being asked questions that she'd already answered in the Rogers trial, or she was being asked questions that she couldn't remember, which she did a lot in the Rogers trial. They'd ask her questions and she was like, I can't remember. And then obviously they'd have to go through the statement and get her to look at it, and then she'd get quite cocky and say, well, I must have said that, or it's written here but I still don't remember saying it. And then the money issue comes up of the money that she's received from Lee County for like the witness protection program that, you know, she'd spoke to David Lebed about it, saying she was, you know, she was scared that Jimmy was being arrested for murder and he was the sole breadwinner, so she had no money, she had nowhere to live. And then, I mean, that's as far as it went, but then the camera panned round and I saw one of Roger's attorneys sat in court today. So then we get on to the defence, and honestly I was really nervous for her because I thought this guy's just going to go crazy on her. And it comes out that the night before Curtis Wright's wedding, her, Rogers and Mark Sievers and Curtis and you know, the guests that had arrived the night before were all in the house. They were having drinks, and it's come out that she was drunk the night before and she thought Mark Sievers was a pervert. There was no further questioning where that was concerned, no reason why. And the hammer that she said she saw in Jimmy's, the big white cooler box, the hammer that was inside there wasn't the hammer that was used to kill Teresa. It was a ball peen hammer, which means it's got two balls on either end. And obviously the hammer that was used to kill Teresa was a claw hammer. Then it was brought up that she'd spoken to Crime Stoppers, which had been brought up before, but nothing more was said. But now we know that if Mark is found guilty at the end of this trial, she will receive $55,000. I mean, she tried to shrug it off like, you know, she wasn't sure of how much it was and if she was going to be eligible to get it. I don't believe it. I don't think anyone else does either. And she's since remarried, and she's had about $20,000 from Lee County so far. And then from the Rogers trial, it was brought up that the police threatened to take her kids and things, and, you know, possibly saying that's why she's testifying that Jimmy had confessed to killing Teresa to her. And obviously it's been brought up again, and she admits that they did threaten to take her kids. So yeah, I think she's as bad as Curtis Wright in my book. Then Bethany Ann Mitchell, she's a physician, and she knew Teresa during her internal medicine training. In 1996, they were lifelong friends and thought of each other as sisters, and her kids called Teresa Auntie Teresa, and Teresa's kids called her Auntie Bethany. And Teresa was godmother to Bethany's oldest daughter. She's only known Mark since he and Teresa started dating. She became friends with Mark, and they often shared special occasions together. And she said that she can confide in Teresa, but also Mark. So I don't know. Weird. I've no words. She said that the strange thing was that Mark wasn't upset over the fact that Wright could have actually murdered Teresa. She said there was no anger that his best friend could have killed his wife. He was just angry that Wright had been arrested, which she obviously thought was odd because, you know, his best friend's been arrested for his wife's murder, and he's angry that Wright's been arrested, not that his best friend could have killed his wife. So Mark then told Bethany that Wright loved Teresa and she had done things to help him, so he wouldn't have any ill will towards Teresa. See, is it just me, or does some of this just sound a bit off? I know that I've heard things like, you know, some type of swinging going on, but nothing's been brought up about that. But I've had that in my mind, and some of these things, it just makes you wonder, or if, you know, if Wright had some sort of thing for Teresa. So Bethany asked Mark about Rogers when he was arrested, and he told her he didn't know who he was and he had never heard of him. But she had seen a photograph of Mark at Curtis Wright's wedding, and she saw a photograph of Mark Sievers talking to Rogers. So she knew he was lying. And then at the end of this examination, she said Mark had a lot of anger towards law enforcement, so he had a lot more anger towards law enforcement than he did for the man that had been arrested for her murder, obviously Curtis Wright. So the cross-examination, it comes out that Bethany contacted the state attorneys about this case on the 5th of November this year, because she was claiming someone was in communication with Teresa, and that someone was Bethany's friend. So I think she's saying that a psychic is saying that she's speaking to Teresa, but obviously nothing more was said about that either. And then the redirect is saying she didn't just contact the state attorneys about her friend who was in contact with Teresa, but also about everything that she'd said previously. Right, we've got a bit of a big one here. Danielle Berardelli. She's another close friend of Teresa's, and they've been friends since teenagers, and she said she was her very best friend. She also became friends with Mark. The minute she found out about Teresa, she flew straight to Florida and arrived the next day and met up with Teresa's family at a Holiday Inn. Then Mark came to the Holiday Inn, and Danielle was sharing a room with Teresa's sister and Lisa. Mark arrived at their room and she said they hugged, and I don't know if you remember I think it was my first video where I said it looked like Mark was crying because he was like that. Well, she said the exact same thing when she was hugging him. It sounded like, it felt like he was crying, but then when she looked at him face to face, there were no tears. And that's been quite a theme through this trial. Every time, they've been talking about how she was actually killed, or the medical examiner and things like that, he starts with the tissue and dabbing, the dry tears. It's a good performance, but I don't think it's fooling anybody. And obviously she said there was no red eyes and no runny nose. Like, she said my eyes were red from all the crying I'd been doing, but he just looked pretty normal, not look like he'd been crying constantly. And bearing in mind, this is the day after his wife was murdered. Shady is the only word I can think of for him. Then she spoke to Mark a bit later on, and she was surprised because the first thing Mark said was about who was going to take care of the kids should something happen to him. And then, obviously he'd spoken to Bethany about the same thing, which they both found very odd. And like I said, anybody would. And then they talked about the life insurance policy, about the money that he would get from that, and that, the kids would be very well looked after. And it confused Danielle. She didn't understand why he was going there so soon after Teresa had been murdered. She stayed in contact with Mark, and part of the reason why was because he told her to call him every day just in case he was arrested and she needed to go to Florida and take care of the kids. It's so bizarre. He's guilty. He is guilty. She was surprised that Wright was arrested. She knew nothing of him, but had spoke to Mark about him. And Mark expressed anger towards Teresa's family for being concerned about the girls' safety, and she thought it was so ironic because he didn't express any anger towards his best friend that had been arrested for his wife's murder, as was previously said. The only time she met Curtis Wright was at Teresa's funeral, and that's how she knew who he was when he was arrested, but she'd never met him previously or been told about him. And Mark also told her that he was concerned about what Curtis Wright would be saying to the police. And she also spoke to Mark when Rogers was arrested, and she'd been sent the same picture as Bethany, the wedding photo. So she knew that Mark had met Rogers and had spoke to him previously. And she asked him if he knew Rogers, and he said no. He told her he didn't know why Wright would kill Teresa, and he didn't believe he did it. And again, he told her about the anger he felt towards law enforcement and that he thought they were trying to pin it on him. And Mark thought he could be arrested at any time. And this was before Wright was arrested. I mean, this is a pretty good testimony. And it matches up with a previous friend. So the cross-examination said that on 1st of July 2015, Danielle gave a sworn statement and she didn't tell law enforcement any of what she's just said. And the testimony she has just given, she told the state in October 2019. Now, bearing in mind, it's okay then bringing that up, but Teresa died at the end of June. They spoke to Danielle on the 1st of July. So a lot of what she said happened after. Granted, she's not spoken to the state until, October, but a lot of this stuff happened after the first time she gave a sworn statement. So I don't know what validity that question was, it just didn't make sense to ask that. And she also didn't know that Mark had insurance policies on himself also. The redirect says that she can't recall Mark ever saying why when Teresa was killed. Your wife's been murdered in her home, and he never once asked why. And the photo that she received was sent in an email to her. She doesn't have the actual email. She just has a screenshot of the picture. Next, we are on to Kimberly Torres. She knew Mark and Teresa because they owned the home where she's living now, which is next door to where the Sievers was living. And she knew them for 6 years, up until the murder, obviously. Her relationship with the Sievers was just neighbourly. They weren't like great friends having parties together and stuff. And a couple of months before Teresa died, Mark went to Kimberly's house asking if she'd seen his dogs, and another time was his kids had made bracelets and she bought a couple of them. And then she's asked a question where she says that she'd seen Mark in her backyard, and she didn't know why he was there. I don't know if she went and asked him, but she was never asked if she spoke to him. I don't know if she did go out, and it does like he was obviously scoping a route out for Mark and Rogers to take to get to Teresa's house without being seen. And he was on the lanai, which is like a porch. He's like decking with a roof but no sides. And she said it wasn't normal. She'd never seen him there before. She's not entirely sure of the month when she saw him. She thought it was February, March, but the state was trying to push for her to say March, April, but they didn't seem to decide on an actual month. And one day, she had some of her family around and they were having a cookout at her house, and she heard Mark and Teresa arguing in their backyard. She did hear part of the argument before she took her family inside to eat, and she heard Teresa say, "I'm fucking tired of this shit, I'm leaving." And then Mark said back to her, "If that's what you want to do, then fine, but we'll see about that." The cross-examination, again, in Kimberly's first interview after the death, she didn't tell anyone about this argument that she'd heard. And she has also given other interviews to the press, to magazines. And in total, she's given 8 interviews. And the testimony she had already told to a magazine called Gulf Shore Life, possibly in April 2019. And in another interview she did, the defence asked if she remembers saying that you were going to do whatever she had to do to make sure those girls got justice. She doesn't remember, but I don't think it's something that the defence would pull out of thin air. She had also said she felt relieved when Mark was arrested and she felt safe, and she admits to not liking Mark. Next is Dr. Thomas Cohen, and he's the medical examiner, and they go over the autopsy again, showing the jury the photos, and Mark is obviously doing his sob routine. Obviously the state's examination, it was just what I'd heard previously in the Rogers trial, so I've got a few notes on the cross-examination of Dr. Cohen, and he says it's hard for him to definitively say what type of hammer was used, and altogether he's done 3 autopsies on people that have been killed by hammers, and it's in his opinion that she was in a fixed position when she was being hit, such as up against a wall or on the floor, and he didn't see any evidence to show that the claw part of the hammer had been used, which totally discredits Curtis Wright's testimony that he saw Rogers using the claw part of the hammer. So yes, right, that's the end of the state's case, and they rested. Then the jury left the room and the defence puts forward a motion for acquittal. So in that, the defence attorney puts forward its case of why this trial should be acquitted. Then the state gets up and puts forward their reason why it shouldn't, and the motion for acquittal was denied. So that's day 7. Quite interesting, and I look forward to seeing you all again on trial day 8. Bye for now.